All right, so here in America, we it's not great right now. And a lot of Europeans and people from non-American countries, so every other country, have been asking, why aren't we doing anything? And just like, any other, video I made, I asked on Reddit, why do we think why do we think that Europeans and every other non-American country, I say Europeans specifically because they seem to be the ones that specifically complain that we're not doing shit about what's going on. So why aren't we doing anything? I wanted to know, like, why is it so just like simple? I shouldn't say simple, but like, why do Europeans just go, let's protest? He's okay. He just yells for attention. Um, he he has to. Anyway, why do Europeans and other people like just have it in them that they would immediately jump to action? When shit gets this bad, but something about America or multiple things about America, we just don't do that, and why is that? Um, I found that, there are multiple potential reasons. And the first is that, there is some level of fear that, your neighbor could, you could face repercussions from like your neighbors in your neighborhood. Um, I'll be real, like, I kind of don't know how realistic that concern actually is at the end of the day. It really depends on the situation. Like, if you were, like, the only way that I could see this as, like, a serious concern slash threat is, like, if you, like, are protesting just, like, within, like, your neighborhood, or, like, you live in a super small town and, like, if you went to like your state's capital, or you went to whatever, town center to protest, and your neighbors saw you and they didn't agree with you, politically. Um, I don't know if that's something that, like, is as common of, or as big of a consideration in Europe. Honestly, I don't think that's something most people in most living situations would have to worry about, really. Um, that sounds like a very small town problem. The person who said that did say they lived in Missouri, so possibly like a small town, but I think who most people have living situations where that is more of an excuse than, I'm just gonna be frank, that's just making up an excuse. Like, I think if you seriously have that little trust in your neighbors and have no actual, like, proof that your neighbors are remotely, violent or reactive like that, like, I think you need to touch grass more. Because, like, not I'll just say it, not every Trump supporter would actually go, picking a fight, like a physical fight, like, and if you're afraid you're just gonna get yelled at by someone. I mean, look, I don't like being yelled at either, but it's like, I'm sorry, like, I think in most cases in the U.S., like, I've lived in different living situations, like mostly suburbs, but I've also lived in like college towns, and like now I live in a city, and I just don't see, that being this being a legit concern for the majority of people. So yeah, like, I don't think that's the best excuse. And also, if anything, Europeans, I mean, obviously I've never lived in Europe, but I feel like with the kind of like small towns slash villages that are in Europe, Europeans are more likely to face that kind of thing. Like they're more likely to have, a neighbor that sees them at some protest and, like may feel some kind of way. Like again, I just think in most cases in America, unless you're in a real small town and in that kind of situation, like I think in most cases that's just not, you know, a that's just not a thing to be super concerned about. Your neighbor like reacting poorly to you. But let's keep going. Um, as far as like being at the protest itself, there are legit concerns that are right now, America specific. In Florida, for example, basically a law in 2021, and I did look this up and it's true, a law was passed in 2021 where basically if, you're in Florida and you hit a protester who's like blocking a street, you basically have the equivalent or very similar to what's known as qualified immunity, which basically means you be able to get away with it, like you'd be able to get away with like hitting a protester basically. If you live in an area like that where, it's legal for people to hurt you like that, for protesting, I don't blame you for, not wanting to protest. I mean, like, I don't blame you for not wanting to get out there, because it's actually dangerous, and in a place like Florida, you're constantly seeing, like, everywhere in Florida, um, I lived in Florida for 5 years, and most of the people I met were great, but you do still see the stories from every part of Florida of, the Florida man. I mean, the Florida man exists everywhere, but like, you do, like, if you're in a place where they're actually protected by law, you know, I don't blame you for not wanting to, engage in that, engage in that legal risk, or just like societal risk. Um, but yeah, like there's also kind of going back to why people don't consider going into protesting in the first place. A lot of people, um, I mean, America is very individualistic. You don't need me to tell you, I'm sure, but like basically, unless it impacts us, we're not, unless these things keep in, unless, what's going on with like Donald Trump and, what's going on in DC, unless that starts impacting us, we're not going to, like, we're not going to really do much, like, part of that is like, ingrained selfishness that's, baked into the culture. Part of that is like from what I can tell, it's like I don't know, how I don't know like how much the rest of the world shares this sentiment, but like in America, like talking about politics, like at work, for example, is taboo. So it's like we're kind of forced not to talk about like it's discouraged to even talk about like our feelings. Like it felt so surreal like when Trump won that none of us could actually talk about, you know, none of us could really have any reaction really. Um, it felt weird because, I was like questioning, like, we all don't like that Trump's the new president, right? But even an autistic person like myself knows that it's super deeply ingrained in American culture to not, let's talk about politics. You know, I can't lose my job, so I'm not going to talk about politics at work. Um, but yeah, it sucks. It sucks that Trump is doing everything he's doing. And here, basically, wow, I totally lost my train of thought. Okay. Um, yeah, so Americans, we don't talk about politics. And I don't think, it's out there to say it's kind of a conspiracy of like, they don't want us to talk about politics so we don't, you know, rebel, so we don't like, like fight the system. So we don't like unite to fight the system. Um, and also just like since we're not, since it's so taboo to talk about politics, that also makes it so like, you know, real, putting political like consideration of like, oh, I should not go to work. I should like go to a protest instead. Like it's harder to really justify that, even out of passion because like I don't want to lose my job because I go to some protest, no matter how important it is, to speak out, to take action. Even when I live this close to DC, like I don't want, I can't afford to lose my job. So, you know, my employer is not going to understand if I'm like, I went out to a protest. That's why I wasn't at work today. I would have to like risk lying, like, calling out sick or whatever. And again, that's probably by design. So, you know, we can't really, it, it is harder here, just like because of our root culture, between the, even if, we're not, you know, individualistic as, people, like, because we're told not to talk about politics at work, because politics is sort of, you know, um, this like unwelcome, thing in work, like we can't really, it's not as easy to like join any kind of even protest without having a little risk of like ruining your life, not to be overly dramatic, but like, you're risking losing your job, and there's we don't have the safety nets. That point came up too. We don't have the safety nets. If we decide to protest and we lose our job, we don't have any safety nets like uh, guaranteeing that we live. You know, guaranteeing that we're able to eat or keep shelter. You know, so in a sense, like we really don't, have a solid like right to protest. Like it's there, but it's not really, something we can really take advantage of. But yeah, so the funny thing though, with the whole like people only care, when it impacts them. I mean, we've seen that, if you've seen those stories about how like, one conservative couple where the wife was, I believe, from Mexico, and she, or El Salvador, one of those countries, and she basically, she gets deported by ICE, or just like, held by ICE, and then she's like returned a month later, and because she supported Trump for whatever reason, I mean, she was like, yeah, like I didn't really want that to happen, but I do support Trump, deporting the evil people. The people I was, locked up with, they were they were good people. They didn't deserve this, but there are people who deserve this. That's what she said, you know? Like, there are people. It's wild that, you know, the people on Trump's side are the ones most likely to look even beyond their own sense of safety, even beyond their own ability to even live in this country, just to support their political beliefs. It's freaking wild. Um, but yeah, you know, that's America, you know, like it takes being part of a cult to like not just think about yourself. It's freaking wild. Um, and also, you know, someone kind of pointed out that people had a similar level of trust in Stalin, where, you know, back in those days, where they're like, oh yeah, Stalin will save us from, you know, the prison that we're about to be put in. You know, Stalin will, you know, fix the problems that Stalin made. You know, you have people who blindly followed Stalin like that. Um, and also, um, sorry, also, we, it's not even fully true that we only care about ourselves, because, you know, even as early back as the Vietnam War, and I'm sure even before that, we did protest things that had nothing to do with us as individuals. Like, most of us, you know, are white people, like, who have no connection with, say, Vietnam, but we care about, you know, like, we have morals. We're like, we shouldn't be in Vietnam. We shouldn't be in Korea. We shouldn't be in Afghanistan. We shouldn't be in Iraq. You know, we shouldn't be doing this shit. You know, free Palestine. Like, you know, we do, you know, protest things, even if they don't directly connect to us, you know. Um, we just, for like, for some reason, I guess if anything, again, you know, our government, you know, isn't gonna feel threatened, so to speak, if we're like, um, you know, back in the day when we were like protesting Vietnam, or, you know, when we protested Afghanistan. Because, like, what can us as citizens do to stop the war in Afghanistan? You know, like, we do have power, you know, if a bunch of us did, like, actually have a strike, you know, in response to what our personal government is doing. So again, you know, we live in a culture that makes it really freaking hard to organize those things. But, you know, uh, we we live in this society, you know. But yeah, like, we're not totally selfish. We just, you know, have a high level of self-preservation and probably doomerism too, you know, because this is so close to home right now, and it feels like, you know, anything we could come up with won't really have an effect, or, you know, isn't really practical, as I've explained already. So, yeah, there's also a completely whole other side that someone brought up of how, like, Americans, you know, since we have like Christian foundations, basically, you know, like, there's the likelihood that some people, you know, just straight up don't want to like harm, you know, the people, or like go against people who are wronging us because they think that's what Jesus would do. Somehow, I don't claim to know the answers, but somehow I don't think Jesus would just sit around and let the country die and like let a lot of people suffer. But, you know, like, I guess some people sit there and go like, well, even if they're doing evil, they mean well, so we should just like forgive them. You know, that's just poor interpretation of the Bible, in my humble opinion. Um, but yeah, like Jesus is my Lord and Savior. I don't think Jesus would be, you know, agreeing that we should forgive, people bringing suffering to lots of people, you know. Um, but yeah, like I don't know. I could go into like, yeah, it would be different if like white people were being hurt, and it probably would. It probably would. But yeah, that was just like on my brain, and I had to like voice it so I could move forward. Um, right, and there is the consideration that Europeans are more, their education basically exposes them, you know, to like the broader history of the world in a way that American K through 12 education does not, So like I think, the point there is that like a lot of people for years now have been drawing all these parallels between what's going on here and what happened in like especially Germany during like the Third Reich and whatnot, and saying like we're just repeating history, and like Europeans, because they know through history that like fighting back is the only way to change things. That's why they're more likely to fight back, versus sitting around and like just doing nothing, So there is that. Yeah, and yeah, again, we're very individualistic, like community, is not encouraged here, and that's why you hear people rant about like third places. Yet, like again, it's another situation where people, who come together to support Trump in some ways show more unity, being part of a cult. It's funny. Um, but yeah, like, and basically, even at the level of the government, you could see that our country is kind of designed to be, as individualistic as possible for the most part, because the only incentive you really have is to be in like a traditional marriage, you know, um, like whether or not gay marriage is recognized in, government marriage, like that's the only connection you're really incentivized to have. Otherwise, you're just kind of like left, otherwise you're kind of left, no incentive to like engage in really any other kind of community, as far as like, uniting together to, you know, be part of a greater whole, let alone like, face challenges as a community. Uh, so yeah, you know. Um, Also, like a big reason why in other countries these big protests are so successful is because they're organized slash put together, however quickly, by official like political avenues. Like the Democratic Party here, the closest thing we've probably had is the March for Our Lives, protests, way back when, like literal years ago. Aside from that, we don't have, um, our political parties really putting together, you know, um, protests like that. It's probably one of the reasons why January 6th was I don't want to say successful, but, it was as, big of a thing as it was because, like, Trump himself was like behind, standing behind whether he wants to admit it or not. He was standing behind whatever the fuck, you know, like would happen, on January 6th. Like, he may not have like planned exactly what should go down, but like he definitely was behind people, storming the Capitol basically. So like, you know, that that seems to check out. Like the biggest successful like political stands, so to speak, in this country and other countries too, have been, you know, in one way or another supported by official political, avenues, basically. Um, like people in the big work unions, they protest, but like, just like progressives, I mean, they only care about the things that are relevant to them. They only care about, say, trains. If they're in the train union, you're not going to see them advocate for, like better maternity leave unless, it's a problem in the train industry is. So, you know, that is aside from political circles, I mean, aside from political parties, that would be the biggest other, thing that the biggest other way of debate, of like fighting together, in protesting. Uh, but yeah, protests have to be disruptive. So like even when we do throw protests here, there, you know, with respect, there are people like, throwing up signs and, like at times being in the way, and they might block traffic, if it's legal in your area. But it doesn't do a whole lot to actually disrupt. And that's why people keep talking about strikes, and putting those together to, and that being like the best way we could fight back at this point, because everything else just like isn't enough, like this is a very corporate country. You gotta hit them where it hurts, basically. You know, that's how it is here. So, like, if you're complaining we're not doing anything, I mean, it's not like someone could put on their Facebook, like, let's do a strike tomorrow, and it just happens, especially because, like, there's some statistic of that's like 11% of your population has to be like part of a strike for it to be effective for people to care. So that's why we're not like just organizing you know uh, strike events like they like on Discord or Meetup, you know, where you know, Europeans could see, because they wouldn't be big enough. It would be like playing hooky and expecting, your school to make a holiday out of your birthday, just because you played hooky. Like, people wouldn't even notice, unless you pointed it out. But anyway, um, the other thing too is the point that unlike a lot of places in Europe, I mean, the US is really decentralized. Like, we have different towns, cities, neighborhoods, um, but like whatever town you're living in doesn't, there's not really a town center that has like a lot of power on its own, especially not to change like national issues, let alone state issues. So if you could walk to your town center, but like protesting there is just like any other protest you've seen on American TV. Like, and even going to your state capital, I mean, it doesn't really have the kind of significance that like going to a country's capital in Europe would, and it's not accessible to most US citizens. even going to your state capital isn't, as easy as a lot of Europeans have it to go to like their country's capital. And even at the state capital, I mean, people are going to their state capitals and protesting. It's just not doing, it's just not this miracle cure that y'all want it to be. I know I'm saying a lot to more so justify like why Americans aren't protesting. I want to give perspective, you know, while kind of investigating, you know, why it might be more like realistic and easy, so to speak, for Europeans to go out and like protest, and like make noise and take action. But in America, we have an individualistic culture. We're very decentralized, and also, you know, even if we wanted to go to our state capitals, we have shit public transportation. Even in the state capitals themselves, I mean, there's not a lot of places to necessarily stand. Except maybe a lawn in front of the Capitol building. There's not a lot of places to safely gather like that. You would have to like, there are whole processes to like get the city to agree, if you can get them to agree, to block off streets so you can protest, like in a state capital. And we care about our economics, so it's gonna be hard to sell, I'm sure. It's doable, but it's a hard sell. I'm sure, like there's a lot of bureaucratic steps to make it happen, basically. Um, yeah, so bad city planning, not pedestrian friendly, it's not helping. Um, but yeah, one thing that is weirdly a bit more legit compared to like scary neighbors is like potential ramifications from your family. Like if you're under 18 and living under your parents' roof and they don't have the same political views you do, or you're, an adult, but you're still living under your parents' roof or under the roof of somebody who doesn't politically agree with you. I mean, this is a problem anywhere you go, but like, it's, not going to be, reasonable to like go out and protest, if are that closely linked to somebody who could disagree with you and cause violence. So if earlier you were saying like, yeah, but what if you live with those people that don't agree with you? There's your, there's your W, as the kids would say. And also, when it comes to like considering, being in a protest, I mean, you don't really have control over how rowdy that shit gets. And if it gets too spicy, the police come in. Now, in Europe, the biggest thing you have to worry about with police usually are, batons and, clubs and them using it on you. That's not as bad as facing the barrel of a gun, because we do have one gun per person or more at this point in this country. So, like, even the scope of violence police can cause here is a lot worse than in Europe. Yeah, I don't know. I'm weirdly laughing at that, but nervous laugh, nervous laugh. And yeah, like if you do get arrested in a protest, which does happen, again, depending on how spicy the protest gets. I mean, if you ended up losing your job, because you were in a protest, I mean, legally they can't fire you for that, but they'll find a roundabout way to lay you off for, if they don't like that you were at the protest. Um, there's not really a safety net. Or if you get super injured somehow, like, if you get shot at the protest, or like you get, I mean, pepper spray, I think the effects go away in like a couple of hours, but, if you were to end up in a hospital, like, or just like lose your job, Americans don't have the kind of safety nets Europeans have, to keep us alive, if we don't have a job. Literally, our ability to live is connected with our ability to produce. Like, even disabled people, like, yeah, they're literally given like a pittance. They're given like $500 to $900 a month or some crazy shit like that, or $1,200 a month. And in most places, that is freaking so like not livable. And I'm not saying that as like a joke. That doesn't even cover rent. Like, people are not exaggerating when they say that. That does not cover rent. So again, and they're cutting SNAP. So it's not a great time, to risk your job. I think that is the biggest thing that makes me subconsciously nervous about going to even any protest, is that I don't have parents I could like live with if I, lost my job. Like, I don't know realistically how likely it is that I would actually lose my job. Again, that would only be a concern if like protests got too spicy, but you can't really be too safe. But yeah, that is. I mean, I'm sure you've heard some of this. What America is like and why it's hard to protest there in a way that it just probably isn't in Europe. Yeah, thank you for watching. Tell me like what your situation is, as far as like how able you would be to protest wherever you live. Talk in the comments below. I'll respond. And yeah, like, subscribe, hit the belly things if you like putting me in your background to ramble while you do things. Also, hi.